Boston, St. Patrick's Cathedral, a freezing November morning, and the bride just walked in to find her own wedding already halfway finished without her. Gavin locked eyes with Audrey in front of 300 guests, his voice perfectly calm. "You're strong, Audrey. You can survive this scandal." Chloe couldn't. Her knees hit the marble, her bouquet scattered across the stone floor. Nobody moved. This is the story of a woman who lost everything in a single morning. Stay for the whole ride. The November wind came sharp off the harbor, cutting right through the silk of Audrey's bridal gown. She stood on the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, her bouquet of white peonies trembling faintly in her grip. She was 20 minutes early. She had planned to be. That was Audrey Brooks, prepared, precise, always a little ahead of schedule. She had never planned for this. The doors were already open. A thin sliver of warm light spilled out from inside. She could hear the organ. It wasn't tuning up. It wasn't a practice run. It was playing full, soaring, unmistakable, the processional hymn. Her feet stopped working. The ceremony had already started. "Don't you dare ruin this for your sister, Audrey." Her mother's voice came from behind her, quiet and sharp as a scalpel. Margaret Brooks materialized at her elbow, dressed in powder blue, hands folded in front of her like she was attending a board meeting instead of watching her eldest daughter's world come apart at the seams. "You were always built to take the fall." Audrey turned slowly. She looked at her mother's face. The woman didn't flinch, didn't look ashamed. She looked resolved, the resolved face of someone who had already made peace with a decision they knew was going to hurt someone else. "What did you do?" Audrey whispered. Margaret glanced toward the cathedral doors, then back at her daughter. "Your father's firm collapsed. Completely. There was a $12 million debt, and Senator Thorne's family agreed to absorb it." A short pause. "But the terms required the marriage to go forward." To Chloe. The peonies were shaking in Audrey's hands. "You could have told me. There wasn't time." "You could have told me," Audrey said again. Her voice had gone flat. Margaret reached up, almost touched her daughter's arm, then thought better of it. "Chloe needed this. The family needed this. You're stronger than she is. You have always been the one who could absorb these things." That was the whole explanation. "You're strong. You can handle it. Here, take the damage." Audrey pushed past her and walked through the mahogany doors. She saw the veil first. Her veil. Custom silk, hand-stitched at the edges, 3 months in the making. She had picked it out in a tiny shop on Newbury Street in February. She remembered that afternoon clearly, the smell of fabric and warm tea, the seamstress with the kind eyes, the careful way she had pinned the lace so it fell exactly right. It was sweeping down the center aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral right now, resting on Chloe's shoulders. Her sister was already at the altar. Gavin stood beside her. Clean-cut, composed, perfectly tailored. 300 guests packed the pews on both sides. Candles everywhere, flowers everywhere. Everything Audrey had planned, arranged, and quietly paid for out of the earnings her father had been siphoning from her, for years, all of it sitting right in front of her, belonging to someone else. A few heads turned when she walked in, then a few more. The ripple spread, pew by pew, until the whole room had gone quiet beneath the organ music. People saw the bride standing in the aisle. Then they looked at the other bride at the altar. Back and forth, back and forth. Nobody moved. Audrey walked forward anyway. She didn't fully understand why. Her body just kept going, one step at a time, down the marble floor. Somewhere in the back of her mind she thought she might say something, demand an explanation. She had a right to that, at least. Gavin noticed her when she was about 10 rows back. He didn't look away. He held eye contact, steady and deliberate, the way he always did in business meetings when he wanted to project control. Unshakable, unbothered. The organ trailed off. The cathedral breathed in silence. Gavin spoke, clearly, loudly enough for the nearest rows to hear every word. "You're strong, Audrey. You can survive this scandal." Chloe couldn't. The silence after that was enormous. It pressed down from every direction. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes sitting on her. A few people near the front looked at the floor. Others stared openly. The wedding coordinator she had hired stood near the side wall, her clipboard held against her chest. She looked at the floor too. Not one person stood. Not one voice said a single word. The bouquet hit the marble before Audrey even realized she'd dropped it. White peonies scattered across the stone, rolling in all directions. Her knees buckled first. Then the rest of her followed. She was sitting on the floor of St. Patrick's Cathedral in her wedding gown. Flowers scattered around her. 300 people watching. Nobody was coming. Nobody was moving. She had given everything to this family. For years, her salary had quietly kept her father's firm breathing, while he made promises he had no intention of keeping. She had swallowed slights, absorbed guilt trips, rearranged her entire professional life around their instabilities, their crises, their convenience. Every time they had called her strong, it turned out to be a setup for the next thing they needed her to endure. Strong meant useful. Strong meant she would still be standing after they were done with her. Now she was sitting on a cold cathedral floor, and every single one of the 300 people her family had invited to watch this moment were choosing to look somewhere else. A shadow moved in her peripheral vision. Someone stepped out from the very last pew. A man, broad-shouldered, unhurried, dressed in dark wool. He moved through the frozen crowd with total calm. People shifted out of his path without him having to ask. He reached her and knelt down, right there on the cold marble. He took both of her hands in his, not gently, not with any hesitation, firmly, like someone anchoring a rope in a storm. She looked up. He was older, mid-50s, a hard face carved by decades of making serious decisions and saying nothing about most of them afterward. Dark eyes. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room, and everyone else was irrelevant. "Easy," he said. His voice was low, no performance in it whatsoever. "Take a breath," she breathed. "You don't have to stay where people decided you don't matter." He didn't say it like a comfort. He said it like a correction, calm, direct, unambiguous. A statement of fact delivered to someone who had temporarily forgotten it was true. He stood, keeping hold of one of her hands, and helped her to her feet. Then he reached back, shrugged off his overcoat, heavy charcoal wool, warm from his body, and settled it around her shoulders without making anything of it. It swallowed her whole. It was warm. She hadn't realized how cold she was until just then. He walked her toward the doors. She didn't look back. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting, the low murmur of 300 people recalibrating what they had just witnessed. She kept walking. The November light hit her face when they stepped outside, cold and bright and real. "Who are you?" she asked. The man didn't slow down. He guided her down the cathedral steps toward a dark armored SUV, idling at the curb, its engine running, a driver already behind the wheel. "Julian Vance," he said. He opened the door for her. She got in, still wrapped in his coat, still carrying the image of white peonies scattered across marble, still hearing Gavin's voice somewhere in the back of her skull. "You can survive this." Chloe couldn't, as if her ability to survive damage was her finest quality, as if being strong enough to absorb what they threw at her was the most interesting thing about her. Julian Vance got in beside her. The door closed. The city slid past the tinted windows as they pulled away from St. Patrick's Cathedral. For the first time all morning, nobody was telling her what to do. Nobody was explaining why she owed them something. Nobody was using her name as a reason to accept something unacceptable. It was a very small thing, but it was something. Audrey pulled the charcoal coat a little tighter around her shoulders and watched Boston go by in silence. The drive to the Berkshires took about 2.5 hours. Julian Vance said almost nothing the entire way. That might have felt strange with anyone else. With him, it didn't. He sat with one arm resting against the door panel, watching the Massachusetts highway unspool through the tinted window. Now and then, he checked his phone, a brief glance, no visible reaction, phone back down. Whoever was sending him messages had to wait. Audrey sat wrapped in his charcoal coat and looked out her own window. Boston thinned out to suburbs, suburbs thinned out to trees, and the trees thickened into the deep November quiet of the Berkshires. The sky was the color of old pewter. She thought about the peonies scattered across the cathedral floor. She thought about Gavin's voice, clear and deliberate in front of 300 people. Then, she stopped thinking about it on purpose, the way you stop pressing on a bruise before you know how deep it goes. Her phone buzzed, then again, then 6-7 times in rapid succession. She looked at the screen. A press release. Mass distributed, she could see from the carbon copy header that it had gone to every major Boston news outlet, 3 social media distribution channels, and the professional association she'd spent 8 years building real credibility with. The subject line read, "Statement regarding the Audrey Brooks incident." The language was her father's. She recognized his particular way of constructing sentences, formal on the surface, cruel just underneath. The release described her as emotionally volatile and prone to self-destructive behavior. It said she had suffered a mental health episode at the wedding ceremony, disrupting a private family event. It expressed deep concern from her parents, her sister, and her former fiancé. It used the word unstable twice. Nowhere in the document did it mention that the woman being called unstable had just walked into her own wedding to find her sister marrying her own fiancé, in her own venue, wearing her own veil. Audrey lowered the phone. They sent a press release, she said. Her voice was even. She was a little surprised by that. Julian glanced over. She held the phone toward him without saying anything else. He took it, read it. His expression didn't shift significantly, a slight tightening around the jaw, nothing more. He handed it back. They're trying to get ahead of the story, he said. Control the narrative before you have a chance to tell your own version. It's working, Audrey said. Her inbox was filling up in real time. Former colleagues, a board member from the Architecture Association, 2 missed calls from her firm's HR department. For now, Julian said. He looked back at the road. And somehow, that was enough for now, because there was something settled in his tone that made the phrase feel temporary rather than permanent. The estate appeared at the end of a long private drive, framed on both sides by old-growth maple and oak, with bare November branches stretching across the sky. The house itself was large but not ostentatious. Gray stone, deep-set windows, built to outlast several lifetimes. It looked like it had been standing since before the highway existed. A small staff met them at the entrance. Nobody gawked at Audrey in her wedding dress. Nobody asked questions. A woman named Clara walked her to a private wing on the east side of the house, a suite with warm lighting, a fireplace already lit, and a wardrobe stocked with civilian clothes in approximately her size. Mr. Vance keeps guest essentials on hand, Clara said simply, and left it there. Julian appeared in the doorway of the sitting room 30 minutes later. Audrey had changed into dark trousers and a sweater. She was standing at the window with a cup of tea, watching the bare trees bend slowly in the wind. Better? He asked. Different, she said. That was honest, so she left it there. He nodded and pulled out a chair at the small round table in the center of the room. He had a folder with him. He opened it and set it on the table between them. The Historic Waterfront Center, he said. The city commissioned the restoration 18 months ago. The original lead architect withdrew 2 weeks back contract dispute. Doesn't matter. The project is $60 million. It's the flagship restoration of the Boston Harbor District, and right now it's sitting completely still. He looked at her. I'd like you to take over as lead architect. Audrey set her cup down. You looked me up 6 months ago, he said. Your adaptive reuse project in the South End won 3 regional awards. Your load-bearing analysis on the old Meridian warehouse is still being cited in structural engineering reviews. You're the right person for this. No flattery in it, no effort to sell the offer. He had assessed her professionally, arrived at a conclusion, and presented it as plainly as he'd present anything else. You're offering me a job, she said. I'm offering you a project you're qualified to lead, and a legitimate reason to be here, he said. You need both right now. She pulled the folder toward her. Preliminary blueprints, site survey reports, materials assessments. She picked up the first page and scanned it. Even at a glance, she could see 3 structural prioritization errors in the existing draft plan. The previous architect had underestimated the tidal impact on the eastern foundation wall by a meaningful margin. They've got the foundation sequencing wrong, she said quietly. I know, Julian said. She looked up. There was something close to satisfaction in his expression, not triumph, something quieter than that. In my house, little bird, he said, we don't ask victims to apologize for bleeding on the carpet. She didn't respond right away. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because I watched your family do something I find genuinely contemptible, he said. And because you're talented enough to rebuild, but you need solid ground to stand on first. This is solid ground. He closed the folder and pushed it fully toward her. What you do with it from here is your business. She took the folder. She spent the next 3 days barely sleeping. The East Wing sitting room became a working studio, rolled blueprints across the table, coffee rings on the survey documents, her handwritten notes filling every margin. Clara brought meals and didn't comment on the organized sprawl taking over every flat surface. Audrey rebuilt the structural sequencing from scratch. She corrected the foundation plan, rerouted the internal load distribution to account for variable tidal pressure on the waterfront side, redesigned the entrance atrium, and drafted a new timeline for materials sourcing. For 3 days, she didn't think about the cathedral. She didn't think about Gavin. She barely checked her phone. She worked, and the work was hers, and it was good. On the morning of the fourth day, she was up at 6 with fresh coffee and clear eyes, reviewing the atrium schematics at the drafting table. The sound reached her from somewhere beyond the estate grounds. Low at first, easy to dismiss as an early delivery, a maintenance vehicle. Then sharper, multiple engines. The particular deliberate rumble of vehicles moving in formation up a private road. Julian appeared in the doorway of the east wing before she could fully process it. His expression was controlled, too controlled. 3 days in his company had already taught her what that looked like. "Stay in this room," he said. She didn't. She was right behind him when he reached the main entrance. Through the tall windows beside the front door, she could see them clearly. 3 vehicles, official plates, men in suits with lanyards and a rolled document already in hand. State marshals. Julian opened the door himself. The lead marshal had the particular manner of someone doing a job he finds unpleasant but necessary. He looked past Julian and found Audrey standing in the hallway. "Audrey Brooks?" he said. "Yes," she said. He unrolled the document. "Emergency injunction, filed this morning in Suffolk County. You're named as primary defendant in a criminal complaint alleging embezzlement of $2.5 million in design funds from Brooks Architecture Group." He extended the paper toward her. "Your professional license has been suspended by the Massachusetts Board of Registration, pending investigation. Effective immediately." The words landed one by one, all of them clearly. She took the document. Her hands were steady. "Who filed it?" Julian said. His volume hadn't changed. Something else had. "Elias Brooks and Gavin Thorne," the marshal said. "Joint complaint." A moment of complete silence. The marshal nodded, turned, and walked back down the front steps. His colleagues followed. The convoy engines started. The vehicles backed down the drive and disappeared behind the tree line. Julian closed the door. Audrey stood in the hallway, holding the injunction, and read through the specific language of the charges. The document said she had diverted client funds into personal accounts. It named 2 specific projects: the Meridian Warehouse build and the Southside Adaptive Reuse work. Her 2 most visible, most celebrated projects, the ones her father had served as financial administrator on. She had never touched those accounts directly. She had just done the work. "He used my projects," she said. "He ran the money through the accounts attached to my projects, and now he's saying it was me." Julian was quiet for a beat. Then, "Yes, that's my license," she said. "My entire career." "Your career is not over," he said, "but we need to move quickly. Come sit down." She didn't move right away. She stood there with the document in her hands and felt the specific, nauseating shape of a trap, closing from a direction she hadn't watched. Her father had known she would leave. He'd had this ready. Or perhaps Senator Thorne had suggested it. Gavin's father, who had every reason to ensure Audrey Brooks had no credibility, no platform, and no professional standing left to speak from. The timing was unmistakable either way. 3 days, exactly long enough for her to exhale. Then this. Julian walked back to her and gently took the injunction from her hands. "Come sit down," he said again. She followed him to the main sitting room. Clara appeared without being asked, set down fresh coffee, and left. Julian spread the document on the table and read it fully, without rushing. "They moved fast," he said, mostly to himself. "They knew I was here," she said. "Someone told them, or they were already watching." She thought about the press release, the speed of it, the comprehensiveness. This wasn't improvised. They had prepared. "What matters right now is what we do next," Julian said. "And what we do next is prove that everything in this document is false, which we can do, because it is false." He looked at her directly. "Do you have access to your personal banking records?" "All of them, several years back." "Yes. Good." He picked up his phone. "I believe you, Audrey. I need you to hold on to that long enough for my legal team to build something airtight." She looked at him. "Why do you believe me?" she asked. Not a challenge. She genuinely wanted to know. "Because I've sat across from a lot of people who built their comfort on other people's pain," he said evenly. I know what that looks like up close, and I know what this document is. He tapped the injunction once. This is a man who stole from you, using your own stolen work as the accusation. He made the call. The term legal team meant something different in Julian Vance's world. Within 4 hours, 3 attorneys had arrived at the estate, not associates. Partners each with specific expertise: criminal defense, civil financial litigation, professional licensing appeals. Audrey sat at the center of the East Wing table and answered every question they asked. Precisely, without embellishment. Her 3 days of safety had ended, but the fight now had a shape, and a shape was something she knew how to work with. Julian's surveillance file on her father was crimson, literally a red folder thick, the kind normally associated with real estate contracts or corporate acquisitions, sitting in the center of the dining table at 7 in the morning with a glass of whiskey placed beside it. Audrey hadn't eaten yet. Julian was already dressed, already at the table, already 2 steps ahead of where she was. He slid the glass toward her when she sat down. I don't usually drink before noon, she said. You don't usually get charged with a $2.5 million felony before noon either, he said. She picked up the glass and took a small sip. Then she opened the folder. The surveillance photographs were sharp, professionally taken. Her father appeared in each one in meetings with men she didn't immediately recognize, though their identities were typed in neat labels beneath each image. State regulators, a licensing board official, 2 men from the Suffolk County Contractor Licensing Office, meeting after meeting, private dinners, a parking garage exchange, a side table lunch at a members-only club she recognized from downtown Boston. Her father in every frame, comfortable, unhurried, working the room. The timeline printed on the folder's interior cover showed dates. 3 of the meetings had occurred during the Meridian Warehouse project, 2 during the South Side work. One had taken place 4 days before the wedding. 4 days before the wedding. While she was confirming florist orders and finalizing table seating, her father had been at lunch with a state licensing official. He never planned to stop, she said. No, Julian said. He was watching her read, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe. He planned to use the wedding as cover. Senator Thorne's connection to your family gave him political insulation. As long as you were married to Gavin, your father had a quiet line to the senator's protection, and when the firm collapsed, she said, they restructured the arrangement. Chloe became the connection instead of you. You became the liability. He paused. Or more specifically, you became the explanation. She closed the folder. They think they can starve you out, Audrey, he said. They don't know I own the supply chain. She looked at him steadily. What does that mean exactly? He pushed off the doorframe and sat down across from her. Your father's leverage in all of this depends on 2 things staying in place: those regulatory contacts keeping quiet, and his version of the financial records staying visible. My legal team spent the night pulling both apart. He leaned forward slightly. Your personal banking records, I need you to walk through them with counsel this morning. I can do that, she said. I know, he said. But I need you to understand what we're going to find before we find it, because it's going to be difficult to sit with. She set the glass down carefully. Tell me. Julian opened a second folder, plain manila, dense with printed documents, and laid 3 pages side by side on the table. Account statements. She recognized the header on each one immediately. Her own bank, her own accounts. Your salary was deposited here, he said, pointing to the left page. Consistently, for 8 years. She nodded. Over those 8 years, a total of $1.8 million left this account in transfers to a second account. He pointed to the center page. This account is registered to a shell company called BG Architectural Consulting, LLC. No website, no business filings, no registered projects. It exists solely to receive funds and redistribute them. She already knew where this was headed. She could feel it coming before he finished. BG Architectural Consulting, LLC, he continued, is registered to Elias Brooks. Her father's initials, her father's company. Transfers from her own paycheck, redirected into a business that existed on paper for the single purpose of taking her money without her awareness. He set it up in 2016, Julian said. About 8 months after the Meridian project launched, when your career started generating consistent, visible income. He paused. You were supporting him for years. You just didn't know it. She sat very still. How much total? She said. Between your salary versions and inflated vendor invoicing on your two flagship projects, conservatively, your father took approximately $1.8 million from you over 8 years. She did the math without trying to. 8 years. The apartment she'd kept deliberately small because she thought she was being responsible. The vacations she'd passed on. The raises she'd funneled back into the firm because her father said the firm needed them. Every time she had said yes because it was family, because they needed her, because she was the strong one. He charged me with stealing his money, she said slowly. Money he took from me first. Yes. And to use my projects as the vehicle to do it. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her arms crossed, looking at the bare gray trees in the estate garden. A cardinal sat on a low branch, impossibly, almost aggressively red against all that gray and frost. She heard Julian's chair move. He crossed the room and stood beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be present. A comfortable silence followed, which felt strange given everything and yet wasn't. I keep coming back to it as a failure on my part, she said quietly. Like if I had paid closer attention, or been less trusting, or asked more questions earlier, I could have stopped it. That's backwards, he said. You trusted your father because he was your father. That isn't a flaw in your judgment. That's him exploiting something that should have been completely safe to feel. She was quiet. Audrey. He waited until she turned from the window. He looked at her with the same steady directness he brought to everything, no softening, no preamble. Self-sacrifice for people who abuse you isn't love. It's self-destruction. He said it plainly, as a statement of fact she needed to hear clearly. Human dignity and equal rights begin with how you treat yourself. You have a moral obligation to demand the respect you so freely give to others. The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the crimson folder on the table. Her father's face in the parking garage photograph, laughing at something the regulator had said, relaxed and unhurried. I never asked them for a single thing, she said. Not once. I just kept thinking if I was useful enough, patient enough, if I gave them enough, eventually they would treat me like I mattered. That's the trap, Julian said. They trained you over years to believe your worth was conditional. That love was something you had to earn through what you absorbed and what you provided. He shook his head slightly. That's not love. That's a ledger. And you were the only one making deposits. She turned from the window and walked back to the table. She pulled the bank statements toward her and began reading through them line by line methodically, the way she approached every structural problem she'd ever been handed, clear eyes, pencil in hand, starting from the beginning. I want to go through all of it, she said. Every transfer, every inflated invoice, every date. We start this morning, Julian said. He walked to the doorway and spoke briefly to someone in the hallway. Within minutes, two of the previous evening's attorneys were back at the table. Priya Shen, the financial litigation specialist, and Marcus Webb, criminal defense. A paralegal set up a laptop and second screen at the far end. Priya spread the first set of documents between them and looked at Audrey. I need you to verify each of these transfers, whether you authorized them, received any notifications, or had any knowledge of the receiving account at the time of each transaction. I didn't authorize any of them, Audrey said. And I didn't know that account existed before this morning. Good, Priya said. She meant it professionally. That's where we start. They worked for 4.5 hours without a significant break. Audrey identified every project disbursement her father had misattributed to her. She pulled up her personal email archive on Julian's secure system and found 14 emails spanning 7 years, 14 separate moments where she had flagged a financial discrepancy to her father and received a confident, detailed, completely fabricated explanation that had satisfied her each time. 14 times she had asked the question. 14 times he had answered it in a way designed to make her stop asking. Marcus made a careful note each time she produced a new document. By the time they paused for lunch, the table looked like a spread for a financial crimes trial. 3 years of statements on one side, email correspondence in the next, professional invoicing records on the other. You've built a very strong case here, Priya said, organizing the most critical documents into a working file. Stronger than I expected from a single morning session. She's precise, Julian said from across the room. He had been present through most of the session, reading his own materials, asking a specific question occasionally. never interfering with the attorney's process. She remembers everything. What happens to the injunction? Audrey asked Priya. We file a counter motion by end of business today, demonstrating material fraud in the original complaint, Priya said. The license suspension can be challenged within 48 hours. There's a rapid review provision for cases involving demonstrable third-party fraud. I've used it twice. It holds up. She looked at Audrey steadily. This is not a case where the evidence is unclear. Your father filed a criminal complaint using records he falsified. The documentation you've given us today contradicts his version at almost every single point. That isn't nothing. That's most of a case. Audrey nodded. After the attorneys left to begin filings, she stayed at the table alone. Julian came back in and set a plate beside her without making anything of it. She ate without looking up. My father cried at my college graduation, she said eventually. Julian sat down across from her. He gave a speech at the dinner afterwards, she said, about sacrifice and family and how everything he'd built had been for us, for me and Chloe. I believed every word of it. Julian didn't respond immediately. People who exploit generosity learn early that the right emotional performance keeps the supply flowing, he said. A father crying at a graduation. A moment of vulnerability right before asking for a favor. It's a tool. It doesn't mean the emotion was entirely manufactured, but it doesn't mean it was real enough to override the pattern. He paused. The most reliable measure is behavior over time, not the performance, the pattern. She looked across the table at him. You're not a particularly comforting person, she said. No, he agreed. A short silence. I think I prefer it, she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression, not much. Just a fraction, and then it settled back into its usual careful stillness. He stood and picked up the crimson folder. My team is meeting with the FBI Financial Crimes Division at 3, he said. These photographs go with them. Your father has been maintaining those regulatory relationships for years. What he did to you is part of a broader pattern, and the Bureau has been interested in 2 of those regulators for an unrelated inquiry. He tucked the folder under his arm. By the end of today, the machine they built to bury you starts getting taken apart. He walked toward the door. Julian, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for fixing it, for believing it needed to be fixed. He stood there for a moment, considering that. It always needed to be fixed, he said. You just needed someone to help you carry the tools. Then he was gone down the hallway, and Audrey turned back to her documents. Outside the window, the cardinal was still on the branch, still impossibly red against all that gray, still entirely unbothered by the cold pressing in from every direction. She picked up her pencil and kept working. The injunction was lifted on a Thursday morning. Priya called at 8:47 a.m. with the news, her voice precise and businesslike even when delivering something genuinely good. The counter motion had worked. The Suffolk County judge, reviewing the case, had found sufficient evidence of third-party fraud in the original complaint to suspend the criminal charges pending full investigation. Audrey's professional license, suspended for 9 days, was reinstated effective immediately. Audrey was standing at the drafting table in the East Wing when Julian walked in to tell her himself, even though Priya had already called. He set a single sheet of paper on the table in front of her blueprints without ceremony. The reinstatement confirmation, stamped and dated. She looked at it for a long moment. Okay, she said. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the foundation diagrams. Julian watched her for a second. A quiet sound came from him, not quite a laugh, not quite approval, something close to both. 2 days later, he came to her with a different conversation. The Boston Heritage Gala is Saturday, he said. It's at the Copley Grand. Black tie. About 400 guests, city officials, major donors, preservation board members. He paused. Gavin Thorne is formally announcing his mayoral campaign there. Audrey set her pencil down. And you think I should go, she said. I think your father and Gavin are counting on the assumption that you're either destroyed or hiding, he said. And I think the licensing board members who matter to your career will be in that room, along with every reporter covering the campaign announcement. He held her gaze steadily. Your name was dragged publicly. The reinstatement is in writing, but paper doesn't travel as fast as a headline. You need to be seen. She thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. What color? She asked. He almost smiled. I believe Clara ordered 3 options. Red, midnight blue, and champagne. She picked the red. The Copley Grand's ballroom was everything the Heritage Gala was designed to be: soaring ceilings, warm gold lighting, tables dressed in white linen and forest green, Old Boston money assembled in its best clothes. String quartet in the corner. Waitstaff moving through the crowd with champagne flutes that caught the light. Every face in the room was connected to something. A development deal, a political endorsement, a seat on a preservation board. Audrey walked in on Julian Vance's arm at 7:15 p.m. in the crimson gown, and the room noticed. She had expected to feel self-conscious. She didn't. She had built structural load calculations for a $60 million city project while being publicly accused of a felony and legally cleared within a week. Self-consciousness was a smaller thing than that. Julian steered them smoothly from group to group. He introduced her without fanfare Audrey Brooks, lead architect on the historic waterfront center, and then stepped back slightly and let her talk. She talked. Easily, confidently, with the kind of specificity that architects deploy when they want someone to understand that they genuinely know what they're doing. Board members asked questions. She answered them. More than once, she saw someone recalibrate whatever they'd read in the news release, reorienting against the actual person standing in front of them. By the third group, she realized Julian had been watching the room the entire time, not her, the room, tracking something she wasn't entirely tracking herself. Gavin's donors are at the far table, he murmured as they moved between conversations. Northeast corner. 6 of them, 3 are city infrastructure investors, 2 are state-level bundlers. And, she said, and they're watching you. She glanced over casually. He was right. The table of 6 had been keeping irregular eye contact with her for the past 20 minutes, the kind of attention people pay when they're revising an earlier opinion and haven't yet decided what to replace it with. She turned away and accepted a fresh champagne flute from a passing waiter. "You brought a knife to a gunfight, Gavin," Julian said very quietly beside her. Audrey brought the man who owns the building. She didn't look at him. She raised the glass and took a calm, measured sip. Then she heard Chloe. The voice came from the VIP lounge adjacent to the main ballroom, a smaller, glassed-in room off the east side where the campaign inner circle had been holding court. The door was half open. Chloe was walking out through it at the exact moment Audrey was passing by. They stopped, 2 feet apart. Under the warm glow of the corridor lighting, Chloe looked groomed and confident, her dress a tasteful navy that she wore well. But Audrey's attention went immediately to her hand, specifically to the ring on her right hand. A sapphire and diamond cluster, antique setting, their mother's heirloom ring, the one that had sat in a velvet box on their mother's dresser for as long as Audrey could remember, the one their mother had said repeatedly would go to the firstborn daughter when the time was right. Chloe saw her looking. She didn't look ashamed. She lifted her chin slightly, and something cold and deliberate moved through her eyes. "You look surprised to see me," Chloe said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, light, social, the voice she used at parties. "I'm not," Audrey said. A beat. Chloe leaned forward slightly, dropping her voice to the register of someone sharing a private confidence. "You were always just our backup plan, Audrey," she said. "Everything we needed from you, we've already taken it. It was designed to wound." Audrey recognized the architecture of it, the specificity, the casual delivery, the premeditated cruelty dressed in the clothes of a throwaway remark. She looked at her sister, at the ring, at the face of someone who had moved through her entire life, treating Audrey's resources, her salary, her work, her patience, her actual wedding as inventory available for redistribution. "Keep the ring," Audrey said. "I hope wearing it makes you feel something you can't name and can't fix." She walked back into the ballroom. Julian was waiting near the press area along the west wall, where a small cluster of local reporters had set up cameras and audio equipment ahead of the campaign announcement. He read her face immediately. "Chloe," he said. "Chloe," she confirmed. He handed her a fresh drink and said nothing else. He understood when silence was more useful than commentary. The campaign announcement started at 8. A campaign coordinator took the podium first, warm and practiced, delivering the biographical framing for Gavin's entrance: community values, public service record, deep Boston roots. The language was careful and polished. Gavin had hired good people. Then Gavin walked up, suit-fitted, smile-calibrated, every inch the aspirational politician. He spoke for 6 minutes: city infrastructure, economic equality, transparent governance. Words Audrey had listened to across dinner tables and private conversations for 3 years. Words she now understood were decoration on a frame that held nothing behind it. Near the end of his remarks, her father appeared at the edge of the crowd. She saw him before he reached her. Elias Brooks, in a tuxedo, face composed, moving through the room with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the night was going his way. He came to stand beside her. He didn't look at her directly at first. He looked at Gavin at the podium, nodding slightly as if appreciating the speech. "You need to end this, Audrey," he said quietly. "Good evening, Dad," she said. Countersuit, the financial disclosure filing, all of it. His voice stayed measured, reasonable. The tone he used when he wanted to frame a demand as common sense. Be a dutiful daughter and drop the countersuit. There's still a path here where we all come out of this intact. The family can recover from this, but not if you keep pushing. She turned and looked at him fully. Elias Brooks, who had redirected $1.8 million of her salary through a shell company over 8 years. Elias Brooks, who had filed a criminal complaint against her using the records of his own fraud, who had sent a press release calling her unstable on the worst day of her life, who had engineered the substitution of one daughter for another in a real estate transactions disguised as a marriage. Standing here in borrowed tuxedo confidence, telling her to be dutiful. "There's something important you've never understood about me," she said calmly. "I was always trying to be a good daughter. Not because I was obligated to be, because I genuinely loved our family. I thought the rules were the same for everyone." She looked at him steadily. "They weren't, and I'm done pretending otherwise." She turned toward the press area. He caught her arm. Not roughly socially, the kind of grip used to stop someone from walking away from a conversation at a party. His voice dropped lower. "Don't embarrass this family." "Dad," she said, looking at his hand on her arm. "I'm going to ask you to let go." He did, slowly. His expression shifted, something less controlled moving underneath the composed surface. She walked to the cluster of reporters. The nearest camera was from Channel 7. The reporter, a woman named Dana Holt, whom Audrey recognized from coverage of the license suspension story, turned immediately when she approached. There was recognition in Dana's eyes, the alertness of a journalist identifying a story shift in real time. "Ms. Brooks," Dana said, moving the microphone toward her without being asked. "Do you have a statement regarding the dropped charges?" "I have documentation," Audrey said. She reached into the slim clutch she carried. Julian had suggested it specifically for precisely this moment and produced a folded packet. 6 pages. Her personal bank records showing the BG Architectural Consulting LLC transfers. The company registration connecting that entity to Elias Brooks. A forensic accounting summary prepared by Priya's firm, stamped and notarized. She handed it to Dana and waited while the reporter scanned the first page. She watched the moment it registered. "This is a financial record showing transfers from your account," Dana said carefully. "To a shell company registered to my father," Audrey said. "Over 8 years. $1.8 million total. The same projects he cited in his criminal complaint against me are the projects through which he ran this money. The complaint was filed to prevent me from disclosing this." She kept her voice level. No performance, no emotion deployed for effect. Just the facts, presented with the precision she brought to structural load calculations. The Suffolk County Court agreed with that assessment on Thursday. The charges were dropped. The cameras were on her now, all of them. She could feel the ballroom shifting behind her, the spreading awareness that something had changed at the press wall. She looked briefly past the cameras toward the donor table in the northeast corner. Gavin's 6 bundlers. They were all looking at the documents. 2 of them were leaning together, speaking very quietly. One had a phone out. Gavin was still at the podium. He hadn't fully processed what was happening at the far end of the room yet, but his campaign coordinator had. She watched the woman touch his elbow and lean in to murmur something. Gavin's composure held, but his eyes moved to the press cluster, and when they found Audrey standing in the center of it, something dropped out of his face that he didn't quite manage to recover. Dana Holt asked 2 more questions. Audrey answered both of them, precisely, briefly, with documentation cited for every claim. Then she thanked Dana, folded her program card into the empty clutch, and walked toward the ballroom exit. Julian appeared at her side without her having to look for him. He offered his arm. She took it. They crossed the full length of the ballroom that way, toward the entrance, past the tables, past the donors, past the string quartet still playing something seamlessly elegant in the corner. At the door, she glanced once more toward the podium. Gavin's coordinator was in full conversation with 3 of the bundlers now. The other 3 were already gone from the table. She walked out. The November air hit the moment the Copley Grand's doors swung closed behind them. Cold, clean, carrying the faint salt edge of the harbor somewhere in the distance. The valet was already bringing Julian's car around. That was precisely executed, Julian said. I had good blueprints, she said. He looked at her. That small, quiet shift in his expression, the one she'd started to recognize, the fraction of warmth that moved through his face when something genuinely surprised him. They got in the car. The city moved past the windows in streaks of gold and amber light. For the first time since the cathedral, she let herself breathe all the way to the bottom. The drive back to the Berkshires was different from the first one. That first drive, she had been wrapped shock and Julian's overcoat, and a silence that was more survival than peace. This time the silence was easy. She watched the city lights dissolve into highway, and then into the dark tree line of the western hills, and she felt something quietly solid, settling into place that had been missing for a very long time. She had stood in front of live cameras and said the true thing, out loud, with documentation, and she had walked away from it instead of waiting to see how people reacted, which was its own small act of freedom. She was done performing her credibility for audiences who had already decided she was the scandal. Your donors were leaving before we reached the exit, she said at some point past Worcester. 3 of his 6 primary bundlers, Julian confirmed. 2 others will follow by morning, once the story runs. Does he know it was coming? He knew you were a variable, Julian said. He underestimated the documentation. A pause. Men like Gavin always believe the story they tell publicly is the story that becomes permanent. They don't account for records. She turned that over for a moment. My father believes the same thing, she said. That confidence is its own kind of evidence. It works until it doesn't, Julian said. She looked out at the dark trees. I want to thank you, she said, for the clutch. The right size for 6 pages of financial documentation. Clara selected it, he said. Julian. I suggested the dimensions, he allowed. She smiled at the window. They reached the estate just past 11. The grounds were still, the exterior lights burning amber against the stone. Audrey changed out of the red gown and came back downstairs in dark clothes, restless with the particular energy that follows high-stakes confrontation, the body still running on adrenaline long after the moment has passed. Julian was on the back terrace with a glass of scotch and no coat. The night air was cold, the sky startlingly clear for November. Stars everywhere, a wide moon sitting just above the tree line. She pulled her own coat tighter and came to stand beside him at the terrace railing. You should be inside, she said. It's freezing. I don't mind the cold, he said. I've noticed. He offered her the glass. She took it, had a sip, gave it back. The scotch was warm going down. They stood there for a while without speaking. Not an uncomfortable silence, one of those silences that happens between 2 people when they have arrived, temporarily, at the same piece. The estate ground stretched out before them in silvery winter light. Somewhere in the dark tree line, something moved. An owl, probably. Tell me about the waterfront project, she said. Before all this. Why that building specifically? He was quiet for a beat, turning the glass in his hands. My first legitimate contract, he said, was the restoration of a community center in Roxbury, 19 years ago. Small project, 400,000, nothing, by current standards. But it was in a neighborhood that hadn't seen a new public facility in 30 years. He paused. I watched what happened after it opened, how people used it, how a physical space built with care changes the character of a neighborhood, not dramatically, not overnight, but permanently. You could measure it. He glanced at her. That's what the waterfront center should be for the harbor district. A space that tells people they're worth the investment. She looked at him. In the 7 weeks since the cathedral, she had built a comprehensive working picture of Julian Vance, his precision, his silence, his absolute unwillingness to let injustice sit in the room unaddressed. What she hadn't fully seen until tonight was this, that underneath all of that, the thing motivating it was genuinely human. He cared about what buildings meant to people. He cared about what spaces said to the people who used them. You could have handed this project to any architect in New England, she said. I hired the right one, he said simply. She turned him to face the grounds again. The moon was higher now. The frost on the grass caught its light and scattered it. Priya's filing on the board charges, she said. Where does that stand? He set his glass on the railing. The board received her documentation package Wednesday. The rapid review hearing is scheduled for Monday. He turned to look at her. Audrey, it's nearly done. Your name is going to be fully cleared by morning. She turned to meet his eyes. He was closer than she'd registered. Or she was closer to him, she wasn't entirely sure which of them had shifted. The moonlight was unkind to no one out here. It just showed whatever was real. His face in it was serious and warm all at once, the way it had been in the cathedral, when he'd knelt on cold marble without any explanation and held her hands. He reached up and brushed his thumb gently against her cheek. One small, deliberate gesture, nothing more. She didn't move. He didn't either, for a moment. You didn't hold the door open, she said quietly. You built the whole frame. His expression shifted that rare softness she'd seen before, opening briefly like a window in a wall. He started. Then they both heard it, faint at first. Carried on the wind from the direction of the highway, from the direction of the city. The distant register of siren multiple, overlapping. Not one vehicle, several. Julian went still. His head turned slightly the way someone does when they're trying to triangulate a sound and not yet sure what it means. His phone went off. He picked it up, read the screen. Something shifted very quickly through his face, not panic. Not exactly. The focused, cold precision of a man who has encountered catastrophe before and knows the first 60 seconds matter. What is it? Audrey said. He looked at her. The waterfront construction site. She already knew before he finished. Fire, he said. She felt the word go through her like cold water. The site was operational tonight, night crew, 2 guards. He was already dialing. My security chief is calling now. She didn't wait. She went inside and pulled up the site management system on her laptop, the one she had access to as lead architect. The system had a live status monitor connected to the site's security console. She opened it. The last automated entry read Emergency Override Exterior Systems 10:40 p.m. Then nothing. The system had gone dark. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it. A voice she didn't recognize. Official, clipped. Miss Audrey Brooks? Yes. This is Sergeant Delgado, Boston Police Department. I'm calling regarding an incident at the historic Waterfront Center construction site. A brief pause. A fire was reported at 10:47 p.m. The site has sustained significant damage. We're also reporting 1 fatality, a night security guard. The room went very quiet around her. A guard is dead, she said, not a question. Yes, ma'am. Another pause. Ms. Brooks, I need to inform you that investigators have flagged architectural design documents recovered from the site as potentially relevant to the cause of the fire. There is an active warrant for your detainment, pending formal questioning. There's a what? She said. Julian appeared in the doorway. He read her face and crossed the room immediately. Investigators are asserting the possibility that structural choices documented in your design files may have contributed to conditions that caused or accelerated the fire, Delgado said. I need you to remain at your current location. Officers are en route. She lowered the phone. She looked at Julian and said it plainly. They're coming here. They're saying my design files caused the fire. He was completely still for 2 seconds. Then he took the phone from her hand and raised it to his own ear. Who is this? He said. And then, after listening, you have a warrant for questioning. That is not the same as an arrest warrant. My attorney will be present before she speaks to anyone. Do not send uniformed officers to a private residence at midnight for a questioning detainment. We will be at the precinct voluntarily by 7 a.m. He paused. I'm aware of my legal obligations, Sergeant. Are you aware of yours? He ended the call. Julian, she said. I designed that building to code. The structural specifications or the load analysis alone took 3 weeks. There is nothing in those files that would I know, he said. Someone has to have altered them. She felt the shape of it coming together even as she said it. Or fabricated a secondary version. Something that looks like my work but doesn't match the real files. She went back to her laptop, pulling up her original design archive. The originals are here. Time-stamped, backed up, unchanged. I can prove Audrey. She stopped. He was standing at the window looking out at the front drive. His face had changed. She came to stand beside him and looked out. 4 vehicles on the private road. moving fast. Not the measured pace of officers doing a voluntary detainment courtesy call, the deliberate formation of a coordinated operation. "That's not a questioning team," she said. "No," Julian said. He turned from the window, and his voice was urgent now, clear. "Listen to me. Marcus is already being called. Do not say one word to any officer when they come through that door. Not one word. Not your name. Not anything. Julian, they're not here for questions. Someone moved tonight specifically because of what happened at the gala. The fire this warrant, it's all the same operation." He took her by the shoulders, one firm, steadying contact. "Trust the process. Trust the documentation. Your original files are untouched. We know that. This doesn't change what's true, it just means we have to hold the truth a little longer in a harder place." The vehicles stopped in front of the estate. Doors opened. Uniformed officers. And behind them, two men in plain clothes with federal identification badges moving toward the entrance from the far vehicle. The knock on the door was police loud. Julian held her gaze for one more second. Then he went to open the door. What happened next happened fast. She knew that in retrospect that it was designed to be fast, designed to be overwhelming, designed to prevent any one person from getting ahead of it. 3 uniformed officers entered. An arrest warrant was presented, not a detainment request. A formal arrest warrant charging Audrey Brooks with criminal negligence and structural sabotage resulting in arson and manslaughter. The charge was manslaughter, because a man was dead. She stood very still while the officer read her rights. She heard every word, but it was arriving from a strange distance, like a radio station going in and out of range. At the same moment, and this was the part she would understand only later, how precisely it had been timed, the 2 federal agents produced a separate warrant, addressed to Julian. His assets and digital infrastructure were subject to emergency federal seizure order pending financial investigation. He was not under arrest. But he was effectively frozen where he stood, surrounded by illegal mechanisms specifically designed to prevent him from doing anything useful in the next several hours. She looked at him over the officer's shoulder as the handcuffs went on. His face was absolutely controlled. His eyes were Narcus Webb, he said. Her attorney's name, a reminder, steady as a compass point. "I know," she said. Then she was walked out the front door of the Berkshire estate into the cold November night, into the back of a police vehicle. The door closed. Through the window, she could see Julian's on the front steps, federal agents on either side of him. He watched the vehicle pull away. He didn't move. He didn't break whatever was running through his expression to hold it back. The estate disappeared behind the tree line. The drive to the precinct took 40 minutes. She spent it looking at her own hands, thinking about the original structural files still sitting in her laptop archive, time-stamped, backed up, unaltered. A night guard was dead. Someone had burned the building she designed and built that detail into the accusation against her. The deliberateness of it was almost architectural in its own right. Every exit sealed before she even knew she was inside. The precinct holding area was cold in the particular aggressive way of institutional buildings, not the clean cold of the November night outside, but the stale, fluorescent cold of a space designed to be uncomfortable. They took her phone, her clutch, her coat. She sat on the bench in the cell and looked at the gray wall across from her. She thought about what Julian had said on the terrace before the sirens started. "Your name is going to be fully cleared by morning." She thought about the guard's name. She didn't know it yet. Someone would tell her eventually. He had been working the night shift at a site she had rebuilt from bad plans into something that should have been beautiful. He had been there because of her project. That sat very heavily. She did not let it consume her. Because consuming grief was what they wanted her to fall apart in here, to feel so responsible for a death she hadn't caused that she would do something desperate and useful to them. She pressed her back against the wall and kept her hands still on her knees. Celebration is dangerous when desperate men realize their cages are closing. Someone had watched her walk out of the Copley Grand on Julian Vance's arm, with 6 pages of documented evidence and cameras trained on her face, and they had understood that they were running out of time. So they had done the most extreme thing still available to them. She sat with that and breathed. Outside the cell, somewhere in the hallway, she heard footsteps and low voices. The particular sounds of a building full of people doing what institutions do in the middle of the night: paperwork, shift changes, phone calls. the grinding ordinary machinery of power. She was here until Marcus Webb found a door. She trusted that he would. She trusted the timestamps on her files. She trusted the fact that truth, properly documented, was a structural material. It held. She pressed her spine against the wall and waited. One blow breaks a person. 3 in a row is meant to bury them alive. Audrey had been in the holding cell for 16 hours when the court-appointed attorney arrived. His name was Richard Foyle. Mid-40s, wire-rimmed glasses, a briefcase that looked like it had survived a decade of low-stakes public defender work. He sat across from her in the consultation room and spread a folder between them with the mild, efficient air of someone working through a Tuesday. "I've reviewed the charges," he said. "Criminal negligence, structural sabotage, manslaughter, serious counts. The DA's office isn't inclined toward leniency given the fatality." He pushed his glasses up his nose. "However, there's a bail application available if we move today. The hearing is at 3. I'd recommend we sign the preliminary paperwork now, so counsel is on record before then." "Has Marcus Webb been contacted?" she asked. "Mr. Webb's office has been unreachable," Foyle said. "I was assigned through the court. Standard procedure when private counsel hasn't formally entered appearance." She looked at the paperwork he slid toward her. It was dense. 3 pages, small font, the kind of document designed to seem routine through sheer volume. She read slowly. She was an architect. Reading technical documents was muscle memory. She worked through paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and stopped at paragraph 4. There, buried in the middle of a procedural clause. Language acknowledging that the signatory accepted responsibility for negligence related to design specifications on the historic Waterfront Center project, pending full review. An admission of fault, dressed in the grammar of a bail application. She put the pen down flat on the table. "This isn't a bail application," she said. Foyle blinked, "Miss Brooks, it's standard paragraph 4. Subclause C," she said. "That's an acknowledgement of design's negligence. If I sign this document, I've admitted professional fault before the investigation is complete. That's not standard bail language." She looked at him directly. "Who retained you?" A half-second too long before he answered. "The court." "Who paid the retainer?" she said. He gathered the papers from the table and stood. "I'll need to consult with the DA's office before the 3 o'clock hearing." He left. He didn't come back. She sat alone in the consultation room until a guard came to return her to the cell. Through the long window of reinforced glass running the length of the hallway, she had a brief, direct sightline into the prosecutor's office at the corridor's far end. The door was open. Her father was inside, Elias Brooks. No longer in last night's tuxedo, he was in a gray suit, composed and unhurried. He was shaking hands with the lead prosecutor, smiling warmly the way he'd always smiled at people he needed something from. The prosecutor smiled back. They were not strangers. She watched until the guard closed the consultation room door behind her. Catastrophe 2 at 6 p.m. in the form of her sister. Chloe was shown into the visiting room ahead of schedule. She was impeccably dressed, which Audrey registered distantly as a choice. You dress well when you want someone to feel the distance between where you are and where they are. Audrey sat down across from her. For a moment, Chloe said nothing. She set her phone face up on the table between them and pressed play on a video already queued up. Their mother, live television, the daytime news desk of Channel 4. Margaret Brooks sat in the guest chair, with her hands folded and her expression arranged into the specific shape of a woman in pain. Soft voice, measured pauses. The reporter asked about Audrey. "We love our daughter deeply," Margaret said, "but we have to be honest with the public. Audrey has struggled with emotional instability for many years. The wedding, she disrupted a private family ceremony, and now this terrible fire. A man is dead." A pause designed to let the weight of it settle. "We believe Audrey is an unstable, jealous psychopath who burned a building to ruin her sister's happiness. As a family, we are devastated. We are cooperating fully with authorities." Chloe stopped the video. She picked up her phone and said nothing for a moment. Then she smoothed the front of her jacket. "There's nothing left for you here," Chloe said. "Mom said what she said on camera. That's permanent. That's the version people will remember." She stood. "I thought you should know." Audrey didn't move. "You came here for your own sake, Chloe. Not mine. You needed to see it land." Something flickered through Chloe's face that wasn't quite triumph. It was closer to hunger the need to watch something she'd wanted to be true confirmed in real time. She left without responding. Audrey sat in the visiting room for another 5 minutes before Zengard returned. She was thinking very carefully about what was still solid: the original design files, the timestamps, Priya's forensic accounting documentation, Marcus Webb wherever he was, Julian who had not contacted her, who had federal agents standing beside him on the estate steps when the vehicle pulled away. 16 hours ago. More now. His legal team was the best she had encountered. They would have found a way through the freeze. He would have called, unless he couldn't. The guard who came for her was not the same one from earlier. He was younger, unhurried, and he delivered the information with the flat affect of someone reading a weather report. "Thought you should know," he said, walking her back toward the cell block. "Word around the building the federal asset freeze on your associate went full seizure this morning. Everything locked." He glanced at her sideways, also hearing he got ambushed on his way to the courthouse. Rumors, but a short shrug. People aren't saying he made it. She stopped walking. The guard kept moving. She made herself follow. Julian, ambushed. Julian, who had walked her out of a cathedral and knelt on cold marble and sat across from her at 7 in the morning with a crimson folder and a glass of whiskey and said, "Self-sacrifice for people who abuse you isn't love, it's self-destruction." Julian, who had planned the dimensions of a clutch bag to hold 6 pages of evidence. Julian, who had stood on the front steps and said her attorney's name like a compass bearing when there was nothing else he could give her. She reached the cell. She sat down on the bench. The fluorescent light above hummed its single flat note. The gray wall across from her was exactly the same gray as before. She pressed her back against the wall and held very still. 3 blows. Her lawyer a trap. Her mother a broadcast. Julian may be gone. She sat with the darkness and did not let it move her. Not because she was unaffected, but because she understood now what these blows were for. They weren't punishment. They were engineering, each one calculated to remove a support beam until the structure collapsed inward on itself. She was still standing. Inside a cell with nothing left and still standing. She pressed her palms flat against the cold bench and breathed. She had one phone call. They'd told her that the night she arrived and she had saved it, spending the first hours refusing to use something irreplaceable until she understood exactly what it needed to accomplish. She understood now. Julian's words had been circling her all night, not the tender ones from the terrace, the earlier ones from the morning of the injunction, when she'd asked him why he believed her. The most reliable measure is behavior over time, not the performance, the pattern. Her whole life had been spent inside other people's structures: her father's firm, her mother's expectations, Gavin's version of a future that had never included her actual self. She had been a load-bearing element in every one of those buildings, and none of them had been designed for her benefit. She knew how buildings worked. She knew how they failed. She knew Senator Thorne's development portfolio. She had studied it during her research for the Waterfront project. The senator's firm had construction contracts with the city going back 11 years. She had noticed while reviewing permit records that several of his projects showed expedited approvals that bypassed standard structural review. At the time, she had noted it as a bureaucratic irregularity and moved on. She didn't move on from it now. She requested her call. The Federal Building Inspector's Office maintained a 24-hour compliance hotline, one of those infrastructure accountability measures that existed specifically because construction fraud was most effectively discovered at odd hours when nobody was watching. She had once called it at 11 p.m. to flag a ventilation issue on a neighboring project. She knew the number. She dialed it from the payphone in the corridor outside the cell block, with a guard standing close enough to hear every word. She didn't lower her voice. She identified herself by name and professional license number reinstated, she noted clearly, pending no outstanding complaints as of 4 days ago. She cited 11 specific building code violations across 3 of Senator Sterling Thorne's active construction projects. She gave permit numbers, project addresses, inspection bypass dates. She referenced the specific regulatory contacts she had seen in Julian's crimson surveillance folder names, meeting dates, the parking garage exchange. She spoke for 9 minutes. The inspector on the other end said very little until she finished. Then, "Ms. Brooks, are you currently available for a follow-up interview?" "I'm currently detained," she said, "but I won't be for long." She hung up and walked herself back to the cell. She slept for 3 hours. The sound came at dawn. Not sirens this time. Engines multiple, synchronized, entering the prison yard from what sounded like two different access points simultaneously. A different quality to the sound. Controlled, deliberate. She was already standing when the guard reached her cell door. Through the narrow window she could see the yard. Black armored Cadillacs, 4 of them, had sealed every exit point. Not blocking, sealed, positioned with the precision of people who had studied the layout before arriving. A fifth vehicle sat center yard, engine off, federal plates, federal badges on the men standing at the yard perimeter. But these were not the same federal agents from the estate steps. Her cell door opened. A different officer, senior, careful in his body language, said, "Miss Brooks, there's an emergency release order. You'll need to come with me." She came. They walked her through the facility to the main entrance. The processing desk officer looked uncomfortable in the way of someone who has just received paperwork that contradicts yesterday's paperwork entirely. He moved quickly. Her phone, her coat, her clutch were returned. She stepped out into the cold morning courtyard. The center vehicle's door opened. Julian Vance stepped out. He was unharmed, impeccably dressed in the same charcoal wool he always wore. He was holding a document federal court seal visible at the top, a judge's signature at the bottom. She stood in the courtyard and looked at him. He looked at her across 30 feet of prison asphalt. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he crossed the yard and came to stand in front of her. He reached back without breaking eye contact, the same gesture as the cathedral steps, and settled his overcoat around her shoulders. "You survived the dark little bird," he said quietly. "Now let's go take your world back." She looked up at him. "You faked it. The ambush rumor, the asset freeze communications, yes," he said. "Senator Thorne needed to believe I was neutralized." That belief made him confident enough to communicate openly. A brief pause. His phone was tapped by federal intelligence for the last 72 hours. Every conversation he had about the fire, the warrant, the paid-off lawyer, all of it, recorded and admissible. "You let me sit in a cell," she said. "I got you out the moment the wiretap produced what we needed," he said. 48 hours. "I am sorry for every hour of it." She held his gaze for a long moment. The morning light was pale and cold and utterly honest. "I used my phone call to report Thorne's construction violations to the Federal Building Compliance Hotline," she said. Something moved through his face. "I know. They called my attorney at 3 a.m. That filing contributed to the warrant for Thorne's arrest." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't wait for a rescue. You built one." "I know how structures fail," she said. He held out his hand. She took it. Steady, firm. The same grip as the cathedral marble, and they walked out of the courtyard together. Through the gates, into the early morning light coming sharp off the harbor somewhere beyond the city skyline. Behind them, inside a federal holding room she could not see, Senator Thorne's attorney was reviewing the same wiretap transcripts that had just dismantled the entire architecture of a frame. She didn't look back. The FBI field office on Government Center Plaza was a different kind of cold from the jail cell. Same temperature, different character. Here the cold was purposeful, climate-controlled, and deliberate, designed for the careful preservation of evidence. Priya Shen had been awake for 31 hours and showed almost none of it. She sat at the head of the conference table with 4 federal financial crimes agents and spread the materials with the efficiency of someone who had been building toward this moment since the day she arrived at Julian's estate. Audrey sat beside her and walked the agents through the architectural files herself. She had requested to do it personally. Julian had supported the request without discussion. She opened the original Waterfront Center design archive on a federal issue laptop and went through its systematically foundation sequencing, material specifications, load-bearing calculations, fire safety protocols. Everything time-stamped from the day she began the rebuild. Nothing altered. Then she showed them the secondary file set that Thorne's firm had submitted to investigators as the official Audrey design documents. She put them side by side on screen. The differences were specific and deliberate. In the fraudulent version, she had allegedly specified a particular fire-retardant membranes insulation on the eastern storage wing, replaced in the fake files with a cheap polyurethane foam product that burned fast and hot. She had allegedly signed off on reducing the fire suppression system coverage in the same wing by 30%. She had allegedly approved an accelerant-adjacent materials storage configuration that no architect with a functioning license would approve. Every alteration pointed back to one beneficiary, Senator Thorne's construction subcontractor, who had pocketed the cost difference on the switched materials across 6 city projects over 4 years. The fire investigation lead, a quiet woman named Agent Cordova, looked at the comparison for a long time. Then she looked at Audrey. You caught the foundation sequencing error in the original plans within 48 hours of being given the project, Audrey said. My instinct on materials is the same. I would never spec foam insulation on a waterfront building with tidal humidity variance. It's not a judgment call. It's basic environmental engineering. Agent Cordova made a note. We aren't going to destroy them, Julian said from the far end of the table. Everyone looked at him. He had been quiet through most of the morning session, present but not leading. We are going to let them destroy themselves under the light of truth. He slid a drive across the table to Cordova. Senator Thorne's debate is tonight. 7 p.m., televised live on 4 Boston networks. The wiretap recordings from the last 72 hours include 2 conversations in which the senator discusses the arson plan directly. One is a call with the police chief who executed the arrest warrant on Audrey. The other is a call with Gavin Thorne. Cordova picked up the drive. We want to use the debate, Julian said. Publicly, in full. Cordova looked at him for a long moment. That's an unconventional request. Senator Thorne has spent 11 years using public institutions as a private instrument, Julian said. The most appropriate place for his accountability to begin is in front of the public he exploited. She looked at the drive, then at Audrey, then back at Julian. I'll need authorization from the deputy director, she said. I'd recommend calling now, Julian said. The debate starts in 8 hours. She made the call from the hallway. It took 22 minutes. When she came back in, she set the drive on the table. We have authorization for a coordinated operation at the debate venue, she said. Arrest warrants will be processed and ready for execution by 6:30 p.m. Audrey looked at Julian. He was already looking at her. Get some rest, he said to her. 4 hours. You're going to want to be there tonight. She was. The debate was held at Faneuil Hall. The irony of the location was not lost on her. The historic meeting house where Boston had argued for its own freedom, repurposed for a politician who had spent years quietly dismantling other people's. The hall was at capacity. 600 attendees, 4 network camera crews, 2 radio feeds, and a streaming platform that put the event live to an additional 40,000 viewers statewide. Audrey and Julian took seats in the 3rd row, center, not obscured, fully visible if anyone chose to look. Senator Thorne opened the debate with his signature combination of folksiness and authority. White hair, immaculate suit, the practiced ease of a man who had been in front of cameras for 30 years. Gavin sat in the front row of the audience section, not on the stage but visible. A show of family solidarity. Campaign optics. The debate moderator asked the first question. The senator was mid-answer when the audio cut in. Not feedback, not a malfunction. Clean, clear audio, fed through the hall's professional speaker system by a technician cooperating with federal agents positioned in the AV booth. The senator's own voice, recorded 70 hours ago on a tapped line, filling the historic hall from every speaker at once. The architect is a loose end. The fire solves that. Make sure the files they find in the wreckage match what we submitted. A second voice, the police chief. And Vance? The senator, if the asset freeze holds, he can't move. By the time he untangles it, she's already convicted. The hall went absolutely silent. Thorne stood at the podium, and his face moved through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, calculation, and something that might have been the specific terror of a man who has always believed he controlled the room, realizing he no longer does. A second clip played. Thorne and Gavin, phone call, 68 hours ago. Gavin's voice was unmistakable. What about the guard? Someone died. Thorne, collateral. The story holds as long as her name stays on those files. Don't get sentimental, Gavin. The moderator stood frozen at her own podium. The camera operators, to their credit, kept rolling. Every lens in the room stayed live. The streaming counter, visible on a monitor in the AV booth, ticked upward. 40,000 became 60,000 became. Within minutes. something approaching 110 as clips hit social media in real time. Federal marshals entered through 3 doors simultaneously. The coordination was clean, efficient, and absolute. 6 agents total. The lead agent mounted the stage steps and presented Senator Sterling Thorne with a federal arrest warrant for conspiracy, arson, manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and public corruption. Thorne said nothing. His composure, 30 years in the making, held just long enough for the handcuffs to close. Then it didn't. 2 agents moved through the audience to Gavin. He stood before they reached him, as if standing were still a form of control. It wasn't. The corrupt police chief was taken from a seat near the side exit, where he had apparently planned to leave early. The hall erupted in voices. Cameras tracked everything. The streaming counter continued climbing. Audrey sat in the 3rd row and watched. She felt no elation. She had expected to, or feared she would the cheap relief of watching someone get what was coming to them. What she felt instead was quieter and more permanent. The specific satisfaction of a structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. Truth, properly documented and properly delivered, holding the weight. Julian's hand rested on the armrest between them, not reaching for her, just present. She covered it briefly with her own. Then she took her hand back and watched the marshals walk Gavin Thorne out of Faneuil Hall on live television with 110,000 people watching. The Suffolk County Courthouse steps were gray granite, worn smooth by a century of footsteps. Audrey had stood on a lot of important thresholds in the past 2 months. The cathedral, the estate entrance, the prison courtyard. This one felt different. This one she had chosen. She had a 9 o'clock meeting with Priya inside, reviewing the final civil settlement terms. She was 20 minutes early. She stood on the steps in a dark wool coat, with good coffee from the cart on the corner, watching the street wake up. She heard them before she saw them. Her father's voice, first, the particular strained register he used when he was frightened and trying not to show it. Then Chloe, something sharper underneath her usual social composure. They came around the corner of the building from the parking structure side, and they both stopped when they saw her. Elias Brooks looked diminished in a way that was hard to place at first. Same frame, same gray hair, same gray suit, but something structural had gone out of him. The confident unhurriedness she had watched across dinner tables for 30 years was completely absent. He looked like a man carrying something too heavy while trying to appear unburdened by it. Chloe stood slightly behind him. She was not wearing the heirloom ring. A civil marshal stood at a discreet distance, present but not intervening. The asset seizure proceedings required supervised appearances. Her father and sister were not here by choice. Elias crossed the bottom of the steps toward her. His eyes were red at the edges. Audrey. His voice came out rougher than she'd heard it before. Please. We need to talk about the civil claims. The house, the firm's remaining assets, what's left, all of it is on the settlement table. We have nothing. He stopped at the step below her, which made her taller than him for once. I know I made mistakes, and I know I did terrible things, but I am your father. His voice cracked deliberately, the way it always did in moments when he needed her to yield. You owe me your life. She looked at him for a long, clear moment. 30 years of memories ran underneath that look. Not just the damage the graduation speech too, the Christmas mornings, the times he had called her remarkable with what seemed like genuine pride. The complicated, painful truth that people who hurt you are not always entirely one thing. They are just, in the end, defined by their pattern, by what they do when something matters, by what they sacrifice and what they protect. He had sacrificed her, consistently and deliberately. He had protected himself every time. Parenting isn't a debt contract, Dad, she said. Her voice was steady, not cold, not performative. Simply clear. You don't get to abuse a child and demand dividends when they grow up. She held his gaze without flinching. Human dignity, equality, and love are fundamental rights. They are not currency to be traded for your greed. You don't earn them back by needing something from the person you spent years taking from. Elias opened his mouth. I forgive you, she said. Those words landed quietly, without drama. Not because you've earned it. Because carrying what you did to me would cost me more than releasing it. I forgive you, and you will never have access to my life again. He stared at her. He had never, in 32 years, heard her say anything like it. She could see him searching for the angle, the opening in the statement, the soft place to press for negotiation. There wasn't one. She looked at Chloe. Her sister met her eyes for 1 second and then looked away at the gray pavement. I hope you figure out who you are, Audrey said to her. When there's no one left to compare yourself to and nothing left to take. I genuinely hope you figure it out. Chloe said nothing. The civil marshal moved forward then gently, professionally. He spoke to Elias about the hearing schedule and guided them both toward the courthouse side entrance. Elias went without looking back. Chloe followed. Their footsteps disappeared around the corner. The street was ordinary around her. Traffic, pigeons, a delivery truck idling at the light. The city starting its regular Tuesday. Julian appeared at her side. He had been somewhere close near enough to be present if she needed him, far enough to let the moment be entirely hers. How do you feel? He asked. She considered it honestly. Like I set something down that I've been carrying for a very long time, she said, and like I can actually feel the difference. He nodded. You said you forgave him, Julian said. Not a question. He was turning it over thoughtfully. I did, she said. Forgiveness isn't absolution. It's not permission, and it's definitely not reconciliation. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. It's just the decision to stop letting what someone did to you live rent-free in the center of your life. She looked out at the street. The court will handle accountability. That's what courts are for. I don't have to. Julian was quiet for a moment. That took more strength than anything else you've done in the past 2 months, he said. I had good material to work with, she said. He looked at her. What material? Someone told me early on that human dignity begins with how you treat yourself, she said, that you have a moral obligation to demand the respect you give to others. She glanced at him sideways. Turns out it also means you get to decide what you carry and what you don't. He held her gaze with that particular stillness of his, the stillness that she now understood was not distance but attention, pure, complete attention. Priya's waiting, he said finally. I know, she said. She finished her coffee. She dropped the cup in the bin at the top of the steps. She pulled open the courthouse door and walked inside, into the warm light of a building where her name was, finally and permanently, her own. The Cambridge apartment had 12-foot ceilings, east-facing windows, and a drafting nook built into the wall above the radiator that Audrey had identified in the listing photographs before she'd even read the square footage. It was hers. Fully, only, entirely hers. 6 months after the cathedral, on a bright April Saturday, with the harbor light coming through every window, she stood on a step stool and hung the curtains in the living room. Linen, warm white, bought from a shop on Brattle Street by herself on a Tuesday afternoon when she had nowhere else to be. She climbed down. She looked at them, 2 degrees off-center, slightly left. She could see it immediately. Her eye for architectural precision was not something she could turn off, even in her own living room. She stood there for a full 10 seconds. Then she smiled and left them exactly where they were. Her life was no longer required to be perfect for anyone else's comfort. The 2 degrees were hers. Across the river, her firm was booked through the following year. Audrey Brooks Architectural had opened its Cambridge office 4 months ago, with 3 projects already contracted: a historic library restoration in Brookline, a mixed-income residential complex in Dorchester, and the rebuilt waterfront center, which was not the commercial property it had been designed as originally, but a free community design center for disadvantaged youth and working-class families in the Harbor District. She had proposed the redesign herself. Julian had funded the transition without being asked, then stepped back entirely and let her lead it. The center opened in March. She had stood in the atrium on opening day and watched teenagers from the Roxbury public school system sit down at drafting tables she had designed, in a building she had rebuilt from the ground up, and begin drawing. That was the win. Not the courtroom. Not the cameras at Faneuil Hall. That morning in March, watching a 14-year-old girl in a school uniform carefully trace the outline of a building she had imagined herself. The criminal convictions had come through quickly. By legal standards, Senator Thorne, Gavin, and the police chief had all entered guilty pleas after the wiretap evidence made trial defense functionally impossible. The senator's construction corruption charges added 4 additional counts. His political career ended the night of the debate and would not be recovering. Her father and Chloe had lost everything the civil settlement required them to lose. They were living separately now, she had heard, from sources she hadn't sought out. She didn't track it closely. They were no longer a chapter she was reading. The April evening was warm enough to leave the windows cracked. She was reviewing the community center's summer programming proposal at her kitchen table when she heard Julian's car in the street below. She recognized the engine without needing to look. He came up with dinner from the restaurant on Mass Ave that had become a standing Friday thing without either of them formally deciding it was a standing Friday thing. The way certain routines establish themselves through repetition and mutual comfort rather than negotiation. He set the containers on her table and looked at the curtains. A long pause. 2 degrees, he said. She said. Left side, I know. He turned to look at her. She was watching him look at the curtains and trying very hard not to smile. You're going to leave them, he said. Already decided, she said. He sat down across from her. He opened the food containers with the unhurried ease of someone completely at home in a space that technically belonged to someone else. 6 months of Friday evenings. The charcoal coat had been hanging on her hall rack for the last 3 of them, having arrived 1 week and simply stayed. The center's summer enrollment closed out, she said. 47 students. We have room for 30. How many are you taking? Julian said. 47, she said. He looked up from the food. I'm adding a second workshop room, she said. The east corner space was always underutilized. It'll hold 12 additional stations without touching the structural footprint. She pushed the programming proposal across the table toward him. I wanted your opinion on the materials budget. He took the proposal. He read it with the same focused attention he gave everything unhurried, nothing skimmed. The equipment line is conservative, he said. Intentionally, she said. I want room to accept donated materials. I've already had 2 suppliers offer in-kind contributions. Double the digital tools budget, he said. CAD software licenses and rendering hardware. These students need to learn on professional-grade equipment, not educational versions. He set the proposal down. I'll cover the difference. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said. She took the proposal back and made a note. He watched her write with that particular quality of attention she had gradually understood was rare for him, the unguarded kind, the kind reserved for things he found genuinely worth watching. They ate. The harbor light faded through the open windows into the warm amber of a spring evening. They talked about the library restoration in Brookline, about a legal matter wrapping up in his business portfolio, about nothing important for a while, the comfortable, easy nothing of 2 people who have run out of the need to prove anything to each other. After dinner, she put the dishes in the sink, and he was standing at the window, looking out at the Cambridge evening. She had something to say and had been deciding when to say it for approximately 6 weeks. She crossed the room and stood beside him. On the drafting table in the nook above the radiator, where she had placed it when he arrived, sat a small velvet box. He noticed it at the same moment she looked at it. A long beat of silence passed between them. She had put it there on purpose. If he saw it, he would understand what she was choosing. If he didn't, she would wait. He had seen it the moment he walked in. She was now certain of that. He walked to the drafting table and picked up the box. He opened it. A ring, simple, architectural in its lines, a small diamond set flush into a platinum band. Something she had chosen for herself as a statement rather than a question. He closed the box. He turned to look at her. You're proposing, he said. I'm deciding, she said. It's slightly different. The rare smile came not partial this time, not the fraction she'd learned to read across months of careful attention. Complete, real. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her hands. 6 months ago, he had taken her hands on a cold cathedral floor and been the first persons in a very long time to do something simply because it was right. No ledger, no negotiation, just a human being deciding that another human being deserved someone to stand up. You saved yourself, Audrey, he said. I just held the door open. She looked at him. This man who had knelt on cathedral marble for a stranger and built an empire on his own terms and told her the truth when it was uncomfortable and waited always for her to be ready. Then let's walk through it together, she said. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle, unhurried. The way the whole evening had been nothing to prove, nowhere else to be. Behind them, the linen curtains moved in the harbor breeze from the open window. Still 2 degrees off, still perfectly, exactly right. And that's where we leave Audrey Brooks. Standing in a sunlit atrium she built with her own hands, watching young people draw the futures they'd been told they couldn't have. 2 degrees of crooked curtains hanging in her apartment window. a ring she chose for herself, a man beside her who never once asked her to be smaller than she was. But before we go, I want to sit with you here for just a moment. Because this story isn't really about a mafia boss, or a cathedral betrayal, or a senator getting arrested on live television, as satisfying as all of that was. This story is about something that happens to real people, quietly, every single day. It's about what occurs when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally attach invisible strings to that love. When they call you strong not because they admire you, but because your strength is convenient for them. When every time they say family comes first, what they actually mean is you come last. Audrey spent 32 years being the load-bearing wall of a house that was never designed to protect her. She absorbed damage, swallowed grief, redirected her salary, rearranged her life, and told herself that if she just gave enough, if she was just patient enough, useful enough, strong enough, eventually they would treat her like she mattered. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when people you trust spend years teaching you that your worth is conditional. It's a slow, quiet education in self-erasure, and the terrible thing about it is that it feels like love while it's happening. Julian Vance said it plainly, and I want you to hear it again clearly. Self-sacrifice for people who abuse you is not love. It is self-destruction. There is a fundamental difference between giving generously to people who cherish you and giving endlessly to people who have learned that you will never stop. One fills you, the other empties you, and the emptying is so gradual that most people don't notice until they're sitting on a cold marble floor, wondering why nobody in the room is standing up for them. Here's what this story asks you to carry with you. Your dignity is not negotiable, not for family peace, not for financial convenience, not for the comfort of people who have already decided you are more useful as a resource than respected as a person. Human dignity is not something you earn through sacrifice or prove through suffering. It is yours from the beginning. It belongs to you the same way your name belongs to you. And the moment someone asks you to trade it for their approval, that is the moment to understand clearly what they are actually offering you, which is nothing real at all. Forgiveness, as Audrey understood it, is not the same as permission. It is not reconciliation. It is not absolution. It is simply the decision to stop letting someone else's cruelty live rent-free at the center of your one life. The court handles accountability. Your heart handles release. Those are two completely separate jobs, and you are only responsible for one of them. And finally, the right people will not ask you to diminish yourself to make them comfortable. They will not need you to be smaller, quieter, or more convenient. When Julian knelt on that cathedral floor, he wasn't offering Audrey a transaction. He wasn't calculating what she owed him or what he could get from her. He simply saw a human being who deserved someone to stand up, and he stood up. That is what genuine respect looks like, not grand gestures. Not declarations, just the quiet, consistent decision to treat another person as though dignity is real and worth defending. Build your life on that. Surround yourself with people who operate that way. And if you ever find yourself in a room where everyone has decided you don't matter, remember the door. It was always there. You just needed someone to remind you that you were allowed to walk through it. Thank you for spending this time with Audrey's story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it tonight. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or institutions is entirely coincidental and unintentional.